A spring afternoon in a suburban garden. I feel a little breath of breeze on my face. I've heard a bee go by just recently, and I smell more plants than I know the names of. Now, you might guess a little bit of that because you can see the environment that I'm in. It suggests other things to your mind. But what if you couldn't see that? What if an author or a poet was trying to paint this scene in pictures? That is a question that occurs to everyone who writes. We're going to have a look at answering it today. Oh, but I should introduce myself. My name is Richard Foss. I'm a culinary historian and author who has been writing about food in Greater Los Angeles for over 30 years. And in all of that time of doing restaurant reviews and other articles, I have probably used every known adjective to describe a bowl of spaghetti. I hope I've used them at the right time and in a way that amused my readers as well as informing them. But restaurant writers are not the only people who really think about how to express the senses. Every writer does this because part of their job is to put you in their body or the body of the character that they're writing. And as such, they need to develop that sense. They go about it in different ways, and today we are going to talk to three experts in different fields: a poet, an academic writer who is also noted for translations, and a best-selling fiction writer. Stephanie Burt is a poet, literary critic, and professor at Harvard University. Among her 8 books is a collection of poetry called Advice from the Lights, and a work about the nature and history of poetry called Don't Read Poetry. You'll find more about that in just a moment. Pleased to welcome Stephanie Burt, whose book is the subject of this year's Big Read, and who really inspired this entire panel because of the fact that your work has some deep descriptions of feelings and of the emotions that are caused by feelings. And in many of the items there, it was about kind of the dislocation between who you were told to be and who you were, and the way your body was trying to tell you things and you were trying to listen to it.
Yeah.
And it just started us thinking about, you use language for the senses in this beautiful, eloquent way. Is that always been part of your work? Is that just always you felt things with this intensity and were able to put it in words?
I mean, it's always been a goal. You never know if you succeed, but I certainly would like to make the world more fun and richer and more available moment by moment through language. I would like to be able to connect the linguistic choices I'm making as a writer to how many senses do we have? I think 8 or 9. 8 or 9 senses with which we move through the world. And I'm always happy when people tell me I've been able to do that. And some of the writers who I most admire and have tried to, carbon copy when I was smaller or younger, have been writers who were known for being able to do that, either by creating intricate sonic patterns or by reflecting the world of the senses, or both.
Right. In the English language, there are a lot of feelings that we just don't have one word for that exist in other languages. And you have to use metaphors, you have to approach them obliquely, because maybe everybody knows what it's like to feel that way, but there's no way of just nailing that down. It forces you to use ambiguity and complex language where in other languages this would be simple. Do you think that that gives a speaker of a language that doesn't have a word for that a challenge and an opportunity?
The oldest short poem that I think about a lot, that means a lot to me, is Sappho 31, the poem in which Sappho is, or her speaker, but it's convenient to say Sappho, is watching the girl she's really into with that girl's chosen guy. And it begins, you probably know it, he seems to me to be equal to a god, that man who sits next to you, and they're at a party or a feast or a ceremony. And Sappho moves from thinking about how divine that guy seems to be. And if you only got the first stanza, if that were all that you got or all that survived, you'd be thinking that's a hot guy or a noble guy or a radiant, divine, blessed guy, because he seems to be equal to a god. But it turns out that the reason he's equal to a god is that Sappho has a huge crush on the girl who's looking at him.
Hmm.
And then she moves into realizing that and into how she feels like she's on fire. She's a brush fire or a wildfire, and she's frozen and she kind of blacks out from how crushed out she is. And the poem, which may or may not have survived entire, it's not entirely clear whether we've lost the last stanza, we probably have, just moves you through her set of ways to feel. So that arrangement of words as a complex and mutable structure of feeling existed and was beautiful and admired and memorized thousands of years before anyone was speaking the language that looked like what we now call English.
Now, I should mention, for those people who are watching this who are not familiar with your work, that you have written a wonderful examination of the nature of poetry called, oddly enough, Don't Read Poetry,
Ah,
that goes into the history of poetry, the various types of poetry, and the language of poetry. Didn't you quote that in that book?
I also talk about Catullus as an easily available, often quoted example of how the poets of the distant past weren't exactly like us, but something of their structures of feeling survives, and that's one of the reasons that we admire what they did. Lest I seem too focused on the West or on languages that I know. Li Bao or Li Po's
Yes.
famous poem about seeing moonlight and missing home is also a very, very good and often translated example of that. And I regret that I don't read, for example, Mayan, because I know from people who do that there are things that look like lyric that survive from Egyptian hieroglyphics and from Maya script.
These poems are the earliest detailed examples we have through human history of someone portraying exactly what a given moment was like, exactly what a given second in time was like. Most of the other writing that we have from the ancient world, a lot of it is official documents, a lot of it is boring stuff. Is there anything older than the first poems that really tells us, wow, this is what's happening to me right now?
Well, if there were, we would call it a poem.
Ah,
So what you're saying is kind of analytically true. Another way to put that, and I don't know the answer, is do the texts that survive as freestanding lyric poems, which seem to have been memorized or sung and recited on their own, are any of those older than the inset lyrical moments in the narrative poems that survive?
could anyone possibly know that?
Yeah, you just ask paleoarchaeologists and people who do historical linguistics. The texts that we now call Homer, I'm pretty sure, are older than Sappho, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, which has beautiful inset lyrics, which are definitely I discuss and don't read poetry, is older than both of them. Um, and the Epic of Gilgamesh has moments. There's a moment that's a funeral song, a lament, how
Yes.
sad it is to lose your best friend who you had a huge crush on. That's the oldest Western lyric, probably, and it happens to take place in the course of an epic, but it's lyric.
Now, the fact that we can be struck by those emotions in something that old
Hmm.
is in some way kind of pointing out the universality of the human condition across time and space in a way that very little else could possibly do.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't like to use the word universality because of the history of that term. It's been used to claim that people like me don't exist, and here I am. Um, uh, but I think I prefer commonality or durability. Um, Sexual feeling is a really good example. Some people are asexual. Some of my friends are asexual. Like ace identities are valid. Those are people who don't experience erotic attraction and have many, many other things that give their lives meaning. Most people do. And when you read poetry about erotic experience or sexual experience that is several thousand years old, like Sappho 31, you can feel a connection. And I would say an authentic connection, a valid connection to the imagined people behind those poems, even though they lived in very different societies. So yes, poetry from cultures that are distant from us in time and in space, at least if it's translated so that it's beautiful and effective in our languages, or if you learn to read their languages, which is always cool, that poetry can demonstrate a commonality, a shared experience of human interiority across vast lengths of time and space.
In your own work,
Hmm.
do you have things that begin as a sensory impression where you say, okay, I have to take that and work it into a story or a narrative? Do you have things that start out as a narrative and you work out the impressions? Does it go in both directions, or is there a pattern that you have where one thing sparks another most of the time?
Oh, it goes in all four or five possible directions. Occasionally, I want to tell a story or react to a story that happens in somebody else's narrative. Sometimes I want to describe an emotion. Sometimes I want to capture a taste or a physical sensation or a sight. Sometimes I just like the way some words sound together. And I want to make a poem from a kernel of sort of verbal discovery.
Are
That's
there
four, isn't it? I promised you five. The fifth would be I take commissions, especially now when we're all seeking connections and sort of fighting isolation. But I've done this for years, and it goes both ways. I like giving and I like receiving from friends and from people I trust commissions. Write a poem. A friend of mine asked me to write a poem with baby sloths pooping last week. And so I now have a poem which I'm, working on. It might be finished. I got to a couple hours to work on it. It may also not be finished for 2 years. I don't know. You never know till you know. But I would not have thought on my own to write a poem about baby sloths pooping. And it's fascinating and it's lovely. And I honestly recommend that if you can watch the widely available Animal Planet video of baby sloths learning to poop, that you do so.
that easily is the weirdest suggestion that anyone has made to me for the year when it comes to watching a video. But
It's super cute. It'll only take you about 3 minutes. Also, the year is still young.
yes, I'm sure that other strange possibilities are there, especially for all of us consuming media that we might not usually consume because of the fact that we're stuck in the house. We're much more suggestible. This brings to mind
Yes.
this brings to mind something though, which is that uh, hasn't poetry always been about seeking connections? I mean, whether or not you're stuck in the house, it's
Absolutely.
taking you to a place that you haven't been before, mentally or physically. It's taking you into a life that is not your own.
Giving you some experiences that you wouldn't otherwise have had and connections to lives and interiorities that you wouldn't otherwise approach has absolutely, for thousands of years, been one of the cool things that verbally intricate, feelingful arrangements of language, that what we call poems, can do. It's never been the only one. Uh, some poems give you experiences and access to characters you would never have had. Other poems reflect some readers back to themselves and show you more about what you're already feeling. And of course, one person's new and strange experience is another person's mirror.
That's interesting to think of because, in the same way, you were talking about Sappho, and that causes me to think most people would assume that reading a 2,500-year-old Greek poet would be the new and strange experience, but sometimes it is the mirror. Sometimes someone contemporary is a window, and sometimes someone ancient is a mirror, and it'd be hard to tell which direction that's going to go.
Yeah, and it's going to vary it's going to vary with the reader. A sort of obvious example, because the feeling is easily glued to a simple narrative, William Wordsworth lost a child and wrote one of his best sonnets that begins "Surprised by Joy," uh, about the experience of being a grieving parent. And that poem is now a little more than 200 years old. Some people who've been lucky enough never to have been in that situation read that poem, and it's mostly a window. Some people, Sandy Hook activists, for example, are going to read that poem and find a mirror. It's the same poem, but they're different readers.
Is there a particular example of a poem that gave you a window into a life where you said, I never thought I would empathize with someone like that, but you just made me do it?
So if I'm going to give you two answers from the last 50 years. One is a life that is obviously distant from my own, and one is I never thought I would empathize. And I talk about this poem in Don't Read Poetry. It's really one of my favorite poems to teach. There's an extremely complicated and challenging poem about being in or starting a late 60s urban riot by Gwendolyn Brooks. It's called Boy Breaking Glass. You may know it. It's one of her best poems. And I'm a white lady from a lot of privilege who has never been in a situation of extreme civil disorder and has never experienced poverty. And Brooks's poem is about a kind of interiority and a kind of rage that I've never experienced. And it's absolutely beautiful. In terms of, I didn't think I could get behind that, but now I see what's going on. There's a poet called Bruce Smith, whose last few books, I really liked a lot, who I believe played college football. And I believe he's in Alabama now, or he was in Alabama for many years. He's now in upstate New York. He's from, I think, Western Pennsylvania. And he writes, one of his great subjects is he writes about the contradictory embodied feelings of cisgender, heterosexual, butch masculinity, about sort of enjoying that and feeling trapped by it and just sort of being a guy. And he's really good at it. And those are, as you may be aware, feelings that I don't have and have never had. And I don't seek out representations of those feelings. If anything, the reverse. American football is certainly not one of my sports. But Bruce Smith is really good. And the work, there's a lot of books. I don't really recommend the earlier work, but his last two books are really good. And that is absolutely one of his subjects. And I wouldn't have expected to be as into his poetry as it turns out I am.
Now, if he had been just as lyrical about the experiences of the physical experiences of running along with a ball and dodging people, or of doing whatever it was that he did, and he hadn't expressed any of the inner curiosity, if it had really been a celebration of the masculinity without the awareness, but he was doing it fantastically well, would you have been able to merely admire it but not empathize with it?
Yeah, that's almost analytically true. Like, I'm going to rephrase the question you just asked. If he didn't put his interiority into the writing, would I get interiority out of the writing? And the answer is no. And there's sort of controls for that, because there are novelistic descriptions of various activities where I will want to read the novel if I'm interested in description of the activity. I just finished Jennifer Iacopelli's Break the Fall, which is a wonderful YA novel about gymnastics and about the sort of pressures placed on girls by various contradictory dictates that cishet girls are given, in particular, about how to grow up and how not to grow up and how to handle pressure. And that is a wonderful novel. It is a novel. Had it had been a novel with the same structure about an activity that I'm not terribly interested in, such as carpentry,
Mhm.
um, I or tennis, and the same novelist writes tennis books, I probably wouldn't have read it.
I probably could read and enjoy something by a carpenter if there was something that I could empathize with, like when you're trying to do a job. I'll give the example of when you're trying to do a job beautifully, even though it's the underside of something and nobody will ever see it, but you will know that you did it beautifully. And that's the way a
Oh,
good carpenter thinks. And I
the
think even if you're not a carpenter, you can get that.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And the standard example for that about sort of pride and craft that no one will ever see is this sort of work on the undersides or the backsides of gargoyles and other stonework in medieval cathedrals. That's way too high up for any actual human to see it, but God sees it and the carpenter sees it. And of course, pride in craft, and for that matter, pride in ornament, is a feeling that moves across the disciplines. I haven't brought up Angie Estes' poetry here yet, but Angie Estes is one of my favorite mid-career poets right now. And one of her several specialties, ESTES, if you're taking notes at home, one of her specialties is to write about pride in craft and pride in ornament and the desire to create and find beauty and sensual beauty, really, even if it serves no apparent purpose.
When we are looking at a lot of the ancient work that you study, we are looking at a set of lyrics with no idea about whether this was something that was meant to be spoken or sung or both. And do you think that, particularly with regard to sensual experiences, uh,
Mhm.
can the mood set by the music add to it, or is there something where you want to be able to read the words and you want to be able to hear the rhythms that are in your head?
It depends. There are certainly poems that work sung or spoken. There are quite a lot of song lyrics that are super boring unless you hear the music, and then they're great. I love the new Halsey album. I've just finished writing about it. But Halsey's lyrics are no great shakes if you just read them on the page. They're meant to be sung. Um, and there are, of course, a lot of poems that don't really benefit linguistically or emotionally from being sung. But I think it's a case by case thing. W.H. Auden, who was reliable and trustworthy except when he was being provocative, liked to say that words for music were the opposite of words that are truly for poetry, because words for music needed to need the music. They didn't work as sung unless they required musical backing. And Auden was thinking about writing opera libretti, and he also was thinking about the needs of his collaborators. And I would never go that far. I think poems differ one from another. But certainly there are words that benefit from being sung. Circling back to ancient Greek, since I'm going to read you a sort of fake translation or imitation from ancient Greek in a few minutes, I should point out that Sappho is a great example of we don't really know the circumstances of original performance. We don't know whether she was writing for a group of people to sing together or for one person to sing, or writing to be read aloud with minimal musical accompaniment, uh, maybe not much of a melody,
Hmm.
rather than having someone really just belt it. We don't know. But with later poets of classical antiquity, we absolutely know. And by the time you get to Callimachus, who my new book is all about, not Don't Read Poetry, but the New Book of Verse. When by the time you get to Callimachus, that is someone for whom Sappho is antiquity. That is someone who is writing in a literate urban society and who expects his work to be read aloud and read silently and copied down and exchanged rather than performed chorally.
It occurs to me that since the topic of this is about the senses, and
Mhm.
you just use the word urban with respect to an ancient piece of work,
Yep.
and the sense that we have of the modern city
Yeah.
is of generally, I mean, and when it comes to the senses, not a particularly desirable place. It's loud, it's smelly with automobile exhaust, there's kind of a cacophony, but there are people who have taken that. I'm thinking like some of the Harlem Renaissance types who have taken the dynamism of the city and gotten very lyrical with descriptions with that are compressed about the urban view of their world.
I love cities, and I think absolutely certain Harlem Renaissance poets, the later Langston Hughes in particular, the Langston Hughes of Montage of a Dream Deferred, one of the great American long poems, um, are able to make cities not only rich in the senses, but desirable. But they're hardly the only ones, right? Hart Crane loved New York. Not a big fan of the subway, but he loved New York. John Gay's Urban Eclogues, which he wrote about walking around London in the early 18th century. If you've heard of him, you've probably heard of him for The Beggar's Opera.
Yes.
He wrote a series of fun and not entirely satirical or sarcastic poems about walking around London. Um, some people have enjoyed being in cities for as long as there have been cities, even as other people and other poets have seen them as tools of the devil. And both those sets of responses are valid if you can embody them in interesting language.
Do I remember correctly that you enjoy science fiction and fantasy?
Very much so, yeah.
In science fiction and fantasy, you have people who are providing descriptions of things not only that you have not experienced, but that you or any other human being will never experience. Sometimes there have been some science fiction writers who have given lyrical portrayals from an alien point of view.
That's right.
And that seems to me to be something where no writers in human history could do this before the rise of modern science fiction, of creating these empathetic creatures who have completely different senses than we have, who can enjoy, in one particular case, there was an art form that is only available to alien senses, and a human is watching all of these aliens who are just looking at a piece of wire, and the aliens can see the currents coursing through the wire and
Oh,
be.
what book are you thinking of? That's a cool example. What book are you thinking of?
It is from a short story that I believe was by Lloyd Biggle Jr. And Lloyd Biggle Jr. was someone who used the arts and the senses very, very well and interestingly in his work. I may be wrong with that, though.
This is something that people who are science fiction critics think about a lot. And Samuel Delany, the novelist and theorist, has written about it. His early work, in particular, when he was still sort of writing science fiction for science fiction readers, has a number of people making arts that don't exist in our world. The challenge of describing a sensory experience that you can't have as a human being alive on the planet now is a very different challenge from the challenge of describing a sensory experience that to most of us is commonplace. And there are theorists of science fiction like David Hartwell who would tell you that it's the opposite. You may be familiar with this argument. If you are Virginia Woolf and you're writing about eating a slice of toast, or let's say buying the flowers yourself, her readers already know what that is. The challenge is to make it interesting and fresh and make it kind of weird. If you are writing about eating a blorg while listening to the sound colors of the Blaffoon, writing about those experiences in a way that's extremely strange and maybe very liquid and interiorized and personal and hard to follow will not work because we don't know what a blorg is or how to play the Blaffoon. You have to be very clear about what you're describing and exteriorize it because your reader has no reference points. And styles of writing that would be extremely boring and are extremely boring often when applied to realism are often the tools that you need to be an effective writer of science fiction.
Extrapolating from that to poetry in general,
Mhm.
isn't part of the job of poetry to make the normal weird and the weird normal?
Depends on the poem, but that's absolutely, those are two of the jobs that poets have historically done and keep doing.
Stephen Barnes is a New York Times best-selling novelist whose work includes science fiction, fantasy, and mysteries. He is also a martial artist and life coach who teaches innovative writing classes. It occurs to me that part of what a fiction author does is try to put the reader into someone else's body, someone else's experience. And I'm curious about any insights you have about both how you describe that in a way that it's going to be familiar or interesting to people who have never had that experience, and also the degree to which you do this. How do you figure out when to stop?
The tools that I use to express emotions or to communicate emotion are partially the question of what is going on inside a person. That's the who am I thing, and what is it to be human thing. But it's also simply creating the world. You can create the world from a God's eye view, or from the view of any particular human being or animal, or from the perspective of a machine, if you really wanted to. Um, and all of the point is to communicate that emotion. There are no objective standards for how much you do it. You basically have to do it until it feels right to you, constantly attempting to refine your own aesthetic sense and trusting that if it works for you, if it really works for you, it's going to work for a significant proportion of a potential audience.
If you look at the work of Ian Fleming, all of the James Bond villains had a kind of gross tastes in food, and they were gluttons. You have your James Bond himself being obviously a gourmet, and in case you don't notice this from actually reading the books, someone who eats and drinks very lightly and in a very healthy way. And whereas his villains just gorge themselves, they're really into the senses. And perhaps Fleming was indicating that those villains lacked a certain something in self-control, or he made their lust for pleasure part of their inhumanity.
Well, James Bond books are the adult version of Dick Tracy. His villains, are grotesques in this exact same way that Flat Top and Mumbles and Pruneface are grotesques. Only it's a little subtler. So it's he's going right down the phrenology line, and to a certain degree, Fleming had flaws, or not flaws, reflected the values of his time in terms of things like sexism and racism as well.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of belief that one's physiology or one's physiognomy reflected one's morality and intellectual capacity. And the books reflected that.
Do other authors do the same thing to some degree in describing the senses of their villains? Do you describe them any differently from the heroes? Do you want people to empathize more with one than the other?
Any writer is going to be on that spectrum someplace, between what a character is and what they do, whether it was in their innate nature or whether it was their environment, and of course, the sane approach, which is say it's some combination of these things, or at least the less dualistic approach. So all writers are going to do that to a degree. If you have a character who is very beautiful, but also evil, then you're using the contrast between the way they look and the way they act. And it becomes jarring because, and you do that deliberately because you know that the reader is anticipating that an ugly person will be the one who behaves in ugly ways. When a beautiful person behaves in ugly ways, it's disturbing because it throws some of our basic beliefs out of whack. It triggers a certain amount of discomfort and fear, because if we would like to think that people who are ugly inside will have some clues on the outside to suggest, to warn us of their ugliness, in the same way that a rattlesnake, has a rattle, or poisonous mushroom has its spots, or whatever it is. But the reality is more complex than that. So the more two-dimensional the writer is, the more likely they are to make their villains grotesque physically. And I think the more realistic they are, the more those villains are going to slip in with the rest of humanity, and you really don't know until you see them behave. If you wrote something from the point of view of a dog whose head is sticking out the window of a car, you're probably going to talk about the rapid succession of smells, coming at them, like a Doppler effect, and in doing that, we give the reader the sense of, this is dogness. So the language is chosen for that. What is the difference between the way this person, this animal, this creature experiences the world, and the way my reader probably does? That allows them to feel like, I'm stepping out of myself and into a different self.
This brings up the question, you as a writer of science fiction and fantasy are sometimes putting people into a world that doesn't exist.
Right.
If Edgar Rice Burroughs had Tarzan eat a banana, well, we've all had the experience of eating a banana, so we have something of the idea of, I know what was happening in your mouth right at that moment. There was this thing that was sweet, and you peeled it, and it was yellow and pale inside, and we get a set of sensory impressions from a banana. You've written some things on worlds that didn't exist. Did you, when you were doing this, think about, this is what the smells would be, this is what the recurring flavors would be? Do you work this stuff out in advance, or do you put in just enough to make it a little bit alien so the reader can figure out the rest for themselves?
The assumption that we are experiencing the world the same way has to be interrogated, because we don't. There are some similarities. So if you go from there to an alien planet, one of the things that would be useful is to say, well, how would a human being experience this other planet? How would it be different from Earth? But then how do the natives on that planet, if there are natives on that planet, how do they experience it? Now you're talking about things that are experiencing reality very differently. Hope they might smell in a different range. Their vision might be in a different range. Their hearing would be in a different range. What they can extract from touching, tasting, smelling, viewing would be as different as what Sherlock Holmes can extract from a clue, as opposed to Lestrade. It's not the same experience at all. So in choosing which aspects of that experience to discuss, it's the same as two people walk into a room. To a degree, you discuss what's in that room that's important for the reader to know about, because there's an infinity of things you could talk about in the room. But to another degree, you talk about the things that the character perceives when they walk in the room, because that tells you what's important to them. And by doing that, what's in the room is what is true. What the person notices is what is it to be human? Is who am I? So those are two different things. And so if you visit an alien planet, you have the question of what is true if you just photographed it, and then the question of what is true if you experience it is a different question, because that question brings into the equation, what is it to be human? And our perceptual lenses and what we add to a situation, how the analogies and the metaphors and so forth and so on that we use to represent reality, because we never apprehend reality directly. It's always through the filter of our experience, our beliefs, our values, and so forth and so on. So in looking into that stuff, you have the possibility of subtly expressing to your reader what the otherness of the world is, or what the otherness of the aliens are, what the otherness is of human beings who have been in an alien environment for years.
Well, if all humans are aliens to each other, how different are we from each other? Might we in some way have a sense of flavor and scent that is more similar to a particular alien than to another person of our own species? How do we get that empathy going?
Unless you're comparing human beings and aliens, what's interesting about human beings largely is how do we experience things differently. Cultures are largely about what do we have in common. And you get people, who will say, this group and that group, liberals and conservatives, whatever it is, have nothing in common. It's a lie. To say that there is much dissimilarity is the truth. To say, well, how do you build bridges when there's so many things that are different? It's by looking at the similarities that you build bridges. So human beings absolutely are going to see reality more similarly on average than human beings and probably any aliens we'd ever be likely to encounter. So if you're just talking about human beings, you're probably going to stress their differences. If you're talking about the difference between human beings and aliens, you're probably going to focus on the similarities within the two groups and the dissimilarities between them.
Do you ever deliberately build a scene where two people who are otherwise would be likely to be enemies, they bond because of some shared sensory experience?
My novel Lion's Blood was specifically written to create a situation where people be forced to examine their assumptions about race. So by having a slave who is white and a master who is black, I'm automatically kind of disconnecting people from their automatic assumptions. But then by what I have to do is to create empathy with each of these. So the white character, Aidan O'Dare, a little Irish boy, his experience in the Middle Passage and being stolen by Vikings and sold to the Moors and so forth and so on, is very alien. But his core emotions, his fear for his family, his fear for his own life, things like this, are just basic Maslow's hierarchy stuff. Anybody can empathize with that. And the emotions and the experience of the lead character in the book, Kai ibn Jalaluddin ibn Rashid, a young Ethiopian boy, he's living in an alien world as well. But his experiences are those of wondering where his place in his family, what is his place in the world, who is he, what is true. And then between these two boys, then one master, one slave, their connection builds over years by shared experience. They experience eating sweets the same way. They experience drinking hemp wine the same way. They both get high off of it. They later on they go out and they find girls together. So they are experiencing sexuality the same way. So that basic human and animal stuff is more important than the differences that exist in terms of their physiognomy. And it's different in terms of their social roles. So by looking at the differences and the similarities, I then get to create a world on which various scenarios play out. And it's all a matter of I have to create language that lays out the game board, which is more or less digital, but I also have to lay out use language that evokes emotion in the reader, because I know that the situation that I'm talking about is one that is extraordinarily painful and confrontational in terms of our society.
Your use of pain as a metaphor here brings up another question regarding pain. When you're describing the life of a slave is mostly going to be pain and privation.
The difference between a slave and a free person is primarily pain and privation. But slaves, just like prisoners in jail, find ways to make their world tolerable or they die. If you keep somebody in pain all the time, they simply shrivel up and die. You can't do it. The person has to have, even if it's a matter of going inside themselves to find peace, they will do it. They make their own worlds of love and sex and food and and the small pleasures that they can find. They dance, they sing when they're in the fields in order to find some way to create a context for the struggle that keeps them from being in pain all the time.
Do you write differently about people in different power relationships, in the sense that a person who has a very limited diet will be thrilled to have a crust of a different type of bread than they usually get. It will be a novelty. There will be something new there. Whereas a person who, for all their life, has had a varied diet doesn't tend to value or wouldn't even notice a new thing on the table. The sense of showing a power relationship by someone being thrilled by an experience that to someone else is, oh, that.
I think that if I wanted to show the power relationship between two people, I would first ask myself, what is true about that? What am I willing to say about this? What do I believe about this underneath it? What is the philosophy underneath that? Between a child and a parent, for instance, the child has certain protections and certain deprivations. The adult has certain freedoms and certain responsibilities. But the child, but working out that relationship and in going internal into the child and say, well, what does this relationship look like from the position of the child? And the child has certain feelings about the world, it has certain experiences of life, and feels it is unfair. I should be able to stay up as late as I want to. I don't want to have to do my homework. These things are all true. Then if you talk about it from the adult's point of view, you see that the adult is trying to prepare the child to become an adult, that the child has to have certain strictures. So you experience the adult, you have the exact same experience. The child looks at a birthday party from the position of cake and clowns. The adult looks at the birthday party in terms of expense, for instance, and organization. How do I get all these people together? How do I pay for all of it? How do I take the time away from business to do this? Because, so you have this little eye of the storm called a birthday party. And by showing the different concerns, using different language to evoke the emotions, and it could be poetics, the poetics of it, or it could just be, utilitarian language.
Well, focusing on the senses, to the child is not distracted by thoughts of expense from
Right.
the cake. And maybe the adult would enjoy the experience just as much if they allowed themselves to forget about the expense and enjoy the cake.
Well, no, I think that would be asking the adult to be a child. That's childish, which is different from allowing the child aspect of themselves to remain alive. The proper relationship for the adult is to take satisfaction that they are competent enough to have created safety for their family. Now they're being an adult, and then when they eat the cake, they can be that little kid that they used to be, but simultaneously be the adult who created the context. That is a much more advanced human soul, because that is a person who has integrated their young self and their older self. That's a much deeper sense of satisfaction. The kid just can't integrate the adult self, does not understand the adult world. But an adult who can do both is a more complete and evolved human being than that person was as a child. That, to me, is the thing that you would really want to represent. How do I show the adult understanding more about the world, but still being able to take great satisfaction in a simple pleasure?
You are a martial artist of many years standing, and I presume that your time as a martial artist has made you a better writer about scenes of conflict, about scenes of physical conflict. And I'm fairly sure that's correct, but I wonder if you also have done other things, just thinking, okay, I'm going to have to write about someone doing this. I better go do this so that I can write about it. Have you ever jumped out of an
Love
airplane
scenes.
because you have to write a scene with that?
Love scenes.
Love scenes.
I realized early in my career that I was better at writing fight scenes than I was at writing love scenes, which seemed weird to me because certainly had a lot more sex than street fights. And so I realized, one of the things I realized is that one of the reasons there was a difference is that I'd studied martial arts, so I understood it, the aspects of that dance. They all had labels, they all had names. They had been taught to me in various structures. Whereas with sex, it was mostly, although certainly I had Havelock Ellis and Albert Ellis and books on this, that, and the other, but mostly it was experiential. the dance of, meeting somebody, your eyes meet, you find each other attractive, you start talking, you go to a more private place to have coffee or whatever, and you go out together. Now you're holding hands, now your arms are around each other, now you have a kiss goodnight, now the kissing gets more passionate, and now. I'd been on the inside of that process, not the outside watching it happen. Whereas with the fight scenes, I'd thought about it. It's like, well, how do you make a fist like this? You do this like this. Every piece of that had been objectified and labeled. So it was, what I realized was what I needed to do was to experience the spiral of seduction and sexual interaction with my observer mode rather than just experiencing it. And so what I did a couple different things. One, I actually found a love scene in a movie that I thought would be safe to work through. It was actually between Dennis Quaid and Ellen Barkin in The Big Easy. And then I found an acting partner who would be willing to work on this with me and go through it with me. And for weeks, I actually worked on that scene, every aspect of it, so that I could understand the dance of seduction, the way words led to looks, led to body language changes, led to touching, led to more intense touching, and so forth and so on. It's like, oh, okay, that's the spiral of it. Then later on, I had the opportunity to actually study a shamanic spiritual sexuality set of teachings. And that created a deeper understanding of how sexuality operates in terms of the entire human body mind interaction.
Reenacting a seduction scene that is between two characters.
Yeah.
It made you a much better writer about relationships?
Oh, heck yeah. Remember, what matters is, does the reader believe in this scene? Whether it's realistic is a separate question from whether the reader believes in it. It's not necessarily the same thing at all. So what something feels like on the inside is certainly valuable, but what symbols allow the reader to process the information such that they feel, I have had the experience of witnessing two people making love. I have had the experience of witnessing. See, that's not necessarily the same thing at all. And depending on, there are going to be cultural reference, the different genres will have different expectations, different people have different attitudes. So studying the way it's done in fiction is very valuable, because I know that millions of people accepted that. Millions of people saw that scene and thought, wow, that's hot. Okay, I looked at that scene and thought, wow, that's hot. Whether or not that it happens exactly like that in real life is a separate issue from the fact, it's like a fight scene in a movie. If people look at a fight scene in the movie and say, and say, wow, that's terrific, then if you're going to do a fight scene in a movie and you want people to have the same emotional reaction that they had to that, that's what you do. If it's in a book and people read that scene and say, wow, this is the best fight scene I've ever seen, you don't say, but that's not realistic, unless you want to appeal to a completely different audience. You need to find an audience that looks at what you think is realistic and thinks, wow, that's a great fight scene. Otherwise, if you're playing for this audience over here, you realize, something, they don't want to hear X, Y, and Z that I know. This is what they want. This is how to communicate with them. If my intention is to communicate with them, I have to speak in their language.
You've just done something really great in terms of delineating part of how a writer thinks and part of how you integrate experiences you've actually had. We're at about the closeout time for this. So are there any thoughts that you'd like to leave us with about how a fiction writer uses or transmits the experience of the senses? Anything that it took you a long time to learn that you'd like some of the other would-be writers or actual writers out there, anything you'd like them to know?
I'd say study hypnosis, because hypnotic language patterns are specifically about putting people into a trance, a relaxed state in which they are receptive. The suspension of disbelief in a story is exactly that. That what you have is words. You have black marks on paper. in order to get people to drop their guard and possibly, if it's a horror story, an adventure story, you're going to put people through things that they would never want to go through in ordinary life. How do you get somebody to do that? You have to evoke something. You have to touch something. Let me read a couple of sentences of this book. If in this book, which is Lion's Blood, it's the one about the swapping of relationships in terms of slave and master. I had to evoke a world that I did not know. I had studied it enough that I felt like I could stay in that world. And this is the world of small Irish villages in 1400. That I had not done enough research to write a full book there, but I felt like I could write a couple of chapters. And it was critically important that when I began, that when I initially started, that the reader was going to be challenging me. I had to get their attention. I had to get their trust. So I started it like this. Therefore, all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Matthew 7:12. Everybody knows that, feels that. It's familiar language. You're going to relax. Okay, that's interesting. I'll go on to the next one. Do unto all men as you would wish to have done unto you, and reject for others what you would reject for yourselves. The prophet Muhammad. So I'm suggesting something that is universal between groups using a familiar cadence of language in our slightly archaic language. The archaic language takes you into once upon a time territory. It takes you into the storytelling mode. It is not purely utilitarian. Now go from there to the first sentence of the book. Spring's first day was a warm, sweet song, a time of companionable silences and comfortably shared labor in Mayen O'Dare's coracle. I'm using a similar rhythm of language as was in the quote from the Bible, the quote from the Quran or the writings of the Prophet Muhammad. And now I'm using poetics in that first sentence to set a scene, as well as an archaic word, coracle. What the heck is a coracle? A person might have to go to a dictionary to find that out. I'm using a word that is natural for Mayen O'Dare. Who's Mayen O'Dare? That's not a name that I know. So I've stepped them from something that they are familiar with, biblical, archaic language, into a world that they are unfamiliar with, but created a bridge from the familiar to the unfamiliar. And now they feel that they're in a world that they don't know. It's a pleasant world. Spring's first day was a warm, sweet song. I've probably got them. They probably cannot stop reading there. They probably have to read the next sentence. And if I do a good job on that sentence, they have to read the one after that and the one after that. So I'm using language, understanding not just what the denotative meaning of the language is, but what the contextual or subtext, the subjective impression that is gotten. I'm thinking about this from the point of view of what is my reader experiencing when they read this. And I'm going to use as many different levels of reality as my head can handle. And that, of course, is what rewriting is for, because you're not going to get all that in your first draft. Your first draft, you just have to do it, and then you go over it and you tune it so that you have a sense, if my reader reads this, what is the cascade of experiences they have? And the task is really to get them to say, I trust this writer. Because you're saying to them, if you trust me, if you will let me guide you, I will tell you a story that will speak to you of the world of these people and the nature of these people. And in the process, you will learn something about the world that you live in and of your own nature.
That is a superb way to finish it. Thank you much for your time, Steve.
You're very welcome, Rick.
Boris Dralyuk is a poet, literary translator, and the executive editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books. He has won awards for translations of poetry from Russian and is also celebrated for his original works. Hello, Boris. Welcoming you to the conversation about language of the senses. As someone who is both a critic and academic who has studied poetry and someone who's a working poet, do you ever feel like generations from before are looking over your shoulder to see if your expressing yourselves in the traditional manner or in a way that fits within some definition of poetry and how people describe things?
That's an excellent question, Richard, and thank you very much for including me in this program. Um, I will say that I can only answer that question not as a scholar and not really as a poet in general, but as myself. And I'm deeply conscious of tradition and traditional forms. Um, and I think that is a legacy of Russian poetry in particular, of the Russian poetic tradition. I myself don't write in Russian; I translate from Russian. Um, I came to this country when I was 8 years old. For me, English is by far the more natural language of expression. Although I, of course, read Russian every day and engage with it. But I'm very much informed by the Russian poetic tradition, both as a critic, as a translator, and also as a poet. Um, so the Russian tradition is one in which the voices of the past matter a great deal, and one is always measuring oneself against one's ancestors, one's literary ancestors. I think that was the case in the Anglophone tradition up until maybe the 60s, the 70s, at which point there was a new romantic turn, and I think originality began to take precedence rather than engagement with the tradition. But I am always conscious of what people did before.
You credit originality with the 1960s, but as far back as Walt Whitman and then later the Harlem Renaissance, there have been periods of time where the almost shocking individuality of expression was part of the American tradition.
That's absolutely true. I think there's always a tension, at least from the Romantic period on, from the early 19th century, between uh, doing justice to what came before and being engaged with the important voices of the past and breaking free of restriction and pioneering new modes of expression. And I think that all cultures go through this back and forth. They oscillate between these two, and every poet, every creative artist oscillates between these two poles. Um, First of all, writing is a traditionally a lonely business, and we look for advocates and look for allies wherever we can find them. Sometimes those are people in the readership among us, and sometimes they're the voices of the past. Some of the more touching poems, for instance, one of the most I think touching poems of Frank O'Hara's is a poem in which he engages with a voice from the past, that of the Russian poet Vladimir Mayakovsky. And Frank O'Hara, you couldn't get a more original voice of the 50s than O'Hara, and yet here he is looking to the past, albeit to the avant-garde past, to find a connection.
There obviously have been writers who did not feel constrained or were not constrained by even very, very formal structures.
Mm-hmm.
The impassioned nature of some of Shakespeare's sonnets, for instance, they obviously feel like they're from the heart, even when they're within this rhymed structure. Isn't it quite possible that this used to be more of that this is perhaps an artifact of an era when poetry was not a lonely thing? It was something that everyone did. People expressed themselves.
And so even within this fixed structure, what Shakespeare does so well, and very few people have managed to do it as consistently as he does, is vary his rhythms so that each word receives the proper emphasis in its place, both in his plays and in his poems. This was, the Renaissance in England was an extraordinary efflorescence, really a remarkable period. The language was new. So much of the language that we use today was first committed, if not to paper, then at least to the speech of actors in that period. We owe 90% of our vocabulary to Shakespeare and Milton. There's just a very little that can reproduce that period of innovation now. It was a time when English was new. So that creates a lot of possibilities. But of course, each generation brings with it new realms of possibility, new vocabulary, new modes of expression. And the way that those modes of expression, the way that the work that's produced in these new ways fits into the tradition, pushes against it, but also joins it, is a very exciting thing to study.
Is there a pattern you can see over long time with poetry, with a different sense of metaphor, a different sense of how to write using in older times there,
Mm.
if they did really have a more limited vocabulary in the era of Shakespeare?
I always thrill when I discover the work of an older poet who seems to be writing out of time. I think Shakespeare does it quite a lot. There are lines of Shakespeare's that one could imagine being said now, being invented now, and many people use images out of Shakespeare. To use a crude one, the beast with two backs, thinking that they're quoting some slang term from the 60s, but in fact they're quoting Shakespeare.
Huh.
With Ben Jonson, one finds this all the time. His poems are so fresh. Some of them have images that are just ripped from Raymond Chandler's novels. My mountain belly and my craggy face. He writes in one of his poems, "Picture Left in Scotland," and that could have been written yesterday. I mean, it could be written tomorrow, and it would have the same resonance that it had in the Renaissance. So I think what you're asking is really profound. Have we invented new metaphors? When I look at the best work of the past, I see voices that resonate with me as freshly as they did when they were first heard. Um, when I read Thomas Wyatt's "They Flee for Me," I see a poem that expresses the feelings of a jilted lover, as well as a poem can, and that jilted lover could have been, in a bedroom in the 1920s, in a bedroom in the 1930s, in the 1950s, all the way to the 2020s, as well as in a room in the castle at some point in the past.
This brings up the question of those people who are writing about environments that we haven't experienced and probably never will. If Shakespeare or Johnson were writing something that was set in urban London, it would be an expression and a description of an environment that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah,
If other writers from the past are really writing to put you in their immediate setting, are those things accessible to us?
I think the best way to answer that question is to look at the stagings of some of Shakespeare's plays. Um, Look at the dynamic stagings of Macbeth, which is set in an environment that is not common today, but it could be placed in the White House and still have the same resonance. It could be placed any place, set any place where power is wielded, and we would understand the grand forces at play in this epic. So the universality of the emotion, the truth of human character, that is consistent. But what changes are the particulars, and the particulars give color and give a sense of a reality to the drama. And even if those particulars are not familiar to us today, they're important because they give a rootedness
It's the
to the act.
particulars that I'm looking for here because we are talking about the language of description and specifically of describing the senses, those things that are often uh, eternal but also internal, in the sense that if I am standing on a hill above the ocean and an ocean breeze is blowing in my face, there's a certain sense of joy from that, a certain sense of freshness that I
Mm.
have to figure probably people have been doing that since Neanderthals, just stopping for a moment and just smelling the sea. And there are some people who have gotten lyrical with that sense of description. And as we read an old description of that, it puts me in the moment, in the body of someone who lived decades or hundreds of years ago.
Absolutely, and I think the thrill of reading something like that, and this segues into translation, the thrill of reading something like that, where the universal component of the scene is perfectly recognizable and allows you to place yourself in the experience, but the the shifts of realia, the little elements that place it at a particular time and a particular setting, those things also allow you the thrill of knowing that you are making a leap. You are finding something in common with a person who very clearly is not you. And so that it's the reality of the scene, the particular details, not the universality of it, that gives you the thrill of transport. The notion that this notion that literature is a means of not just communication but of travel, in a way, travel into the mentality and the reality of another human being, is very important to me, and I think that's what makes translation such an exciting enterprise.
Can you address something about the structure of language and the way that things are described? I know that you are fluent in uh, of course, in Russian because you've translated from that, but also that you have at least a reading knowledge, as you described it, of French.
I never find it really a challenge to render a complete scene with all of its peculiarities into English from Russian. The challenge, when people talk about untranslatable words, they're really talking about words, individual words. And I agree that some words may be untranslatable in isolation, but
Mhm.
we translators never translate words in isolation. We always translate words in context. So it's perfectly possible, for instance, to say that the emotional range of the Russian language is, on the one hand, richer than that of English, because there are more words to describe states like anguish and despair, one thinks, in Russian than in English. But it's not really true. I mean, English has just as many words. They don't match one for one with the Russian range. But uh, when you find a word like toska, which is this wonderful Russian word for an extreme longing, Nabokov describes it as anything from spiritual anguish at one end to kind of boredom at the other end. When you find this word in isolation, well, it could mean any one of those states, but you never find it in isolation. You always find it embedded in a context where a full human being is expressing the fullness of her or his their emotion.
In some cases, if there isn't that exact word, it forces someone to use a metaphor or some distinct combination of words that is not common but gets the idea across. And the novel way of getting the idea across is literally what we in English would think of as poetic language, as a poetic way of saying something rather than a direct one.
Absolutely, translation is exciting precisely because it forces us to find new tools to express something. But at the same time, where do I search for those new tools? I search in the poetry already existent in English. I rely partly on my creativity, as much of my creativity as I can muster at the moment, but also I rely on my knowledge of what has been done in English. And every once in a while, I'll think I'm inventing something, but really what I'm doing is I'm digging deep in my store of acceptable and accepted and established phrases and metaphors, and plucking something that's perfect for the context. I am a great advocate of limitations. I love limitations as a creative device. Any kind of heuristic limitation, a limitation that allows you to learn something, to create something new, because you're casting about for a way to accomplish something and don't have the tools at hand. You find new tools. So absolutely, translation is exciting precisely because it forces us to find new tools to express something. But at the same time, where do I search for those new tools? I search in the poetry already existent in English. I rely partly on my creativity, as much of my creativity as I can muster at the moment, but also I rely on my knowledge of what has been done in English. And every once in a while, I'll think I'm inventing something, but really what I'm doing is I'm digging deep in my store of acceptable and accepted and established phrases and metaphors, and plucking something that's perfect for the context.
There have been American poets who have shocked people by lovingly describing, oh, shooting up heroin, for instance, or
Sure.
something similar, where the vividness of the description almost makes you think, well, maybe I'd like to try that. And then you go, oh my God, what am I saying? But they just made it sound so alluring. And how subversive it can be to describe something in a way that uh, gives that sensibility that shocks someone.
Well, I think that the Russian tradition does have figures of this kind. Obviously, descriptions of alcoholism are really sometimes delicious in Russian literature. One of the great novels of the late 20th century is called Moscow to the End of the Line, in a very good translation by Benedikt Yerofeev, and it's a samizdat novel, a novel that could not be published when it was originally written in 1969,
Mm.
uh, and was only published uh, many years later in the 1980s. And in fact, when it was published in the Soviet Union, it was published as a cautionary tale against alcoholism. But it was not written as a cautionary tale against alcoholism. It was written as a description of the life of a person who is fully disillusioned, who has completely given up. It was an explanation of how one may live in the Soviet Union, and it appeared from the novel that the only way in which one can go on living is by giving oneself up entirely to alcoholism. And the descriptions, and that sounds pretty bleak, but it's actually one of the funniest works in Russian literature, and also linguistically one of the most creative. And there are a number of novels from that period, from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, none of them published in the Soviet Union until the very last years of the Soviet Union, if anything, but all of them really innovating linguistically, really pushing the boundaries of acceptable speech and acceptable subject matter, and all of it for readers who were reading these things in manuscript or in hastily copied typescripts.
Is there anything about the work, your original work, that you look at and say, I describe things this way because I, somewhere from my childhood, is this Russian nature, and in my experience as translation, even when I'm writing in English, even when I'm not trying to, it
Mhm.
just comes out this way?
Well, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I'm a hopelessly sappy person, a really saccharine kind of guy, very, very maudlin, and all of that comes, I think, from my love of a particular branch of Russian literature. Now, I come from a city in Ukraine called Odessa, so to call the Odessan school of writing Russian is accurate partly because, of course, most of it is done in Russian. Most of the great Odessan writers, like Isaac Babel and the poet Edward Bagritsky, wrote in Russian. But they were very much, first of all, Jewish and also Ukrainian, Southern in culture. And so that mix of influences made that school of writing a very special one. And I think they're all quite romantic. Uh, and they very much like the sea breeze that you described earlier. A lot of scenes of the breeze hitting, mustachioed faces on the coast of the sea, and that continues to appeal to me when I translate. I never have more fun than when I'm translating something from Odessa, be it a criminal ballad or a work of high literature like one of the stories of Isaac Babel. They're all infused with the same kind of salty spirit and the same romantic tones, and as well as a wink and a nod and a good deal of humor, and all of that I think informs my writing. Whenever I do write something, it can't help but come out partly Odessan.
I love the fact that there is such a thing as a criminal ballad.
Uh-huh.
That as a genre was not something I was not familiar with. But I find myself wondering, in the criminal ballad, is there an exuberance of description that is kind of designed to take the middle class or upper class people who read it and make them feel like the poor people, the peasantry? They feel things deeper, they feel things with more honesty.
Well, yes, I think that that's definitely the case. I'm not sure whether it's honesty, but it's certainly depth and passion. But to say that the criminal ballad is an Odessan invention, it would be a real stretch. It's definitely not. It has roots in other cultures. When we think of the Anglo-American tradition, we think of the murder ballads and the border ballads, which are also full of inexplicable crimes and bursts of passion. And these are things that are centuries old, but sound like country western songs that were written 2 years ago.
Do these ballads and the best work in Russian poetry, are they designed to, are any of them really designed to take you inside another person's life and sort of force you to empathize with a kind of person that you wouldn't usually meet or empathize with or want to know? Is there something that they do using poetry to make it so that your viewpoint character is feeling this thing and sort of against your will because you're
Yeah.
having their feelings described, you find yourself empathizing with them?
I think the negative charisma of the heroes of these ballads, as well as of Isaac Babi's gangster stories, is very strong indeed. But I'm always reminded of the fact that when you read a good detective story in which the hero is a private eye, you pretend that you're a private eye. When you read a good crime novel in which the hero is a criminal on the run from the law, you empathize with the criminal and kind of pretend that you're a criminal while you're reading it. And the same thing happens in any effective work of literature, be it high, middle, or low. In the case of Isaac Babel, I think he does manage to convey, because it is high literature, because he manages to convey both the horror and the charm of the criminal lifestyle. And it's all because it's most of the stories are seen through the lens or the thick glasses of the hero. And the real hero, who sometimes appears on the scene, sometimes doesn't appear on the scene, is Babil himself, a kind of nebbish who desperately wants to live the romantic and emotionally rich and brave life of a gangster, but he also knows that he can't fully belong to that world. Uh, and so I think the mark of it, the mark of Bible stories as really top-notch literature, rests on that ambiguity, the ambiguity of perspective, the fact that he can make us fall in love with the gangsters, but at the same time be repulsed by their actions, and we're constantly feeling this push and pull. Do I or do I not want um, to buy in to the myth of this gangster world?
Are there any contemporary works you can think of in English that have quite the same thing where we are we are forced by being placed inside that body and having these things described, we're forced to, if not necessarily like someone, to empathize with them, to sympathize with them?
You mentioned earlier in the conversation the Harlem Renaissance. I think so much uh, of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man has to do with that kind of effect, the effect of having you understand, um, the experiences of an African American in that position, in the position of having dropped out of society. Uh, um, and to understand why a person would do that. And I think that the Harlem Renaissance tradition was, of course, uh, um, these works were written both with an African American audience in mind, but very much with a broader audience in mind as well. And they were an attempt to communicate the particular experience of African Americans, both to members of the community as well as to members of the larger American community and to the global community. I also think of classic Los Angeles novel Chester Himes's "If He Hollers, Let Him Go," and that's very much an attempt to put people in the mind of a desperate young man who has come to Los Angeles to make a living, or just to live, and finds himself in an impossible situation. So the noir tradition is very rich in that kind of perspective shifting.
I know someone who is Czech who said that the quality of Czech writing went down after you could say whatever you wanted, because prior to that, you had to be creative. You had to use beautiful and oblique language because you just couldn't come out and say things. And do you think there is, in that limitation of being able to express a thought where you have to express it by a reaction or by gorgeous language, do we lose something in an era in which we can say anything?
That tradition of saying something between the lines, writing between the lines, is called in Russian literature Aesopian language, the language of Aesop. It's fabular. Everything is a fable. You basically, it turns the entire work into one large metaphor for what one wants to say. And now that all the gates are open, and all of the possibilities are there for you, I think people do struggle to uh, it, it, um, to infuse their work with the kind of interest that it had when there were many more limitations. There was a thrill to reading between the lines that now I think it has not completely perished, but it's certainly less effective than it was in the Soviet period. And I think the same goes for other cultures and other communities. Um, when forced to write elliptically, when forced to write around a subject, one gets quite creative. And now, when one can just come out and say something, well, what's the premium? What's the interest? Where's the innovation? Where's the challenge? But I do think that these are good problems to have. Having to incite interest uh, without the external pressure of a government breathing down your neck or a society that doesn't accept you for who you are, is a good challenge for writers to have. Now, okay, so now you can say anything, but say it in an interesting fashion. Get me interested, even though I know that you're not going to go to jail for expressing these views. Make me interested in them anyway.
Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate and look forward to reading more of your work. You've now heard each of our authors discuss the theory behind the way that they express the senses in their writing. And now, a little dose of practice. First up, Stephanie Burt reads her new interpretation of an ancient poem from Greece.
My brand new book from Princeton University Press. It is called After Callimachus, and it consists of translations, adaptations, and imitations that are based tightly or loosely on work by the ancient Greek poet Callimachus. And this one is based on the epilogue to Callimachus's long poem called the Aetia. And the Aetia, which just means origins, it's the same as the root of the word etiology in English, is a poem in which Callimachus retells various origin stories for minor gods and weird place names and other occurrences of the ancient Greek world. So he's just been telling a lot of stories. Aetia, Book 4, Fragment 112, the epilogue. My muses, my graces, I'm tired. My teachers, who told me you would reward my service, told the truth. You paid my electric bill. You brought me fresh fruit. You gave me patience while I tuned that much strung, much plucked lyre. I brought you roses and songs and stories from my country. I began with the history of the gods and with explanations of why things are the way they are. And when you got bored, I pretended the clouds were sheep and made up antagonists shepherds could overcome. But now that's done. I know that everything's political, but I need a break from shepherds and flocks and pastures, from God's founding cities and heroes and orators and gullible crowds. We love and admire you, muse of history, whose sisters met Hesiod under the sign of the horse. Please take a vacation and come back to us in better health, or at least with good news. We admire you too, Holy Lord of Lords, great Zeus, who looks after our great leaders in peace and war, or at least protects the incumbent. My friends and I need more time to ourselves. We might just walk around in one of our tiny gardens and chat about words and sex and cuisine and collectibles and maybe learn what the obscure, archaic phrase to have fun meant.
Next, we have Stephen Barnes reading the opening lines of his novel, Great Sky Woman.
Still Shadow was ancient now, what her people called a woman of dust. 4 tins of warm rains had moistened her deeply weathered face. Daily walking on hills and plains, hot tea brewed from the poison grub plant's spiky leaves and milky roots. And the grace of Great Mother herself kept the old medicine woman's back straight and her tread light. Still Shadow was thought tall, standing a hand's breadth higher than the average Abandi woman, the height of a typical male. Her skin was the color of dark clay, her black hair tightly coiled, her wise old eyes black and flecked with gray. Like other medicine women, other dream dancers, she covered her breasts and genitals with beaten and softened deerskin flaps, partially for protection from the cooler air atop Great Earth, but also in recognition that her 7th eye belonged to Father Mountain and his sons, the Hunt Chiefs. She clicked and clucked to herself and slipped a wrinkled hand into the speckled brown deer hide pouch dangling at her waist. From it she extracted a fibrous pellet of crushed insects, ground leaves and herbs, bound with fresh, moist fungus from sacred caves on Great Earth's western face, the powerful hallucinogenic mixture medicine women called godweed. The crone tucked it between her gum and lip, savoring the chewy texture with anticipation. Her cheek tingled as the extracts of nettleberry, thistleroot, and poison grub leaves filtered their way into her blood.
Finally, we have Boris Drolyuk reading a poem written by a Russian émigré in 1962 about the Los Angeles farmers market.
Farmers Market by Vernon Duke, born Vladimir Dukelsky, translated by Boris Drolyuk. Plump little clouds like rolls of bread lie on the sky's blue tablecloth. The sun is orange marmalade, scooped generously from the jar. Breakfast is ready, it would seem, but we will never reach that high. Besides, our time has not yet come. We're plenty happy where we are. Just show us to the farmer's market, that citadel of gluttony, lavish abode fit for Lucullus, where fruits and vegetables and flowers arch like a rainbow over earth and dazzle countless looky-loos. The meat upon a nearby tray is ruddy with ferocious health. At any moment it might leap right down and turn into a calf. A fresh-caught fish puffs out its cheeks and gives a crab a flirty wink. Its scales still drip with salty water, all iridescent, nacre-like. Bronze-colored coffee from Brazil does battle with the sea's strong smell, but both are in the end defeated by the aroma of the dill, the savory odor of Dutch cheese, the serenade of gorgonzola. Let's sit down at the nearest table, and I will go and fetch your choice. Mexican rice flavored with saffron, a salmon of the palest pink, a lobster with 2 piercing whiskers, sweet buttered cobs of golden corn, perhaps Italian minestrone, or a gray soup of swallows' nests, prepared, of course, à la chinoise. There is no perfume, no thick fog. All is so obvious, so plain, and tuneful without any music. A purely thoughtless tenderness, uncomplicated happiness. And that, my dear, will do for us.
There are an infinite number of ways to consider and express the senses, and though we interviewed 3 masterful writers, this program can only scratch the surface. I hope this inspires those of you who write to consider the language that you use, and I hope those of you who read have a deeper appreciation for how writers put you in another body to feel what they feel. The authors we interviewed have given us a recommended reading list, which is posted on the website we set up for this program. If you appreciate their work, I hope you will investigate the work that inspires them. We hope this program inspires you, and thank you for watching.